hopefully it works. All right. I was talking about, so recall the entire idea of the TEWA 1 course. This one is that we are focusing on Bayesian statistics and cognitive modeling. So recall that the first half of the semester, we focused on how to better understand the concept of Bayesian equation and Bayesian statistics. So why that is important. So we used examples not from like cognitive task, but just basic, some simple statistical examples like the coin flipping, like linear regression. And we focus on how we could get the posterior parameter estimation given the data. So this is the, if you recall the Bayes equation, we are talking about the left-hand side, so the posterior. Because calculating the posterior can be quite tricky, and we then turned to a technique called MCMC, so Markov chain Monte Carlo. So this is the basic technique that Stan is employing. So we are using Stan as a tool, as a helper, so that we could get a rough estimation, approximation of the posterior. So once we understood how this parameter estimation works, we then turned our attention from simple statistical examples to cognitive examples. And then we used one example called the reinforcement learning framework. And specifically, we focused on the Riesco-Wagner model. So in the sense that just basically talk about the reinforcement learning model. So here that we are agents and we are like people, human participants, and we are surrounded by some environments, maybe some unknown environment. So what we can do to get a better understanding of the environment is to interact with the environment, to see what happens if we do something and what else happens if we do something else. So we, as active human, so we make some action and we see what's the consequence can be derived from those actions. So here the consequence then is to us, from the perspective of us, this is observation. So we observe the consequence that is caused by our action, and we use this observation or the consequence or the feedback or the outcome, however you call it, we use those observations to update our belief regarding the environment, and we might change and adapt our actions flexibly so that we could have an even better understanding of the environment. So this is the graphical illustration. And then if you recall this graph on the right-hand side, this is pretty important. So if you see the literature, in particular decision-making, this is quite an influential framework. So it's divides decision processes into several steps. So the very first one is that you ask, so imagine that you are participants, and if you are sitting in front of a computer or if you are in a virtual reality environment, some people nowadays, they are doing virtual reality experiments, or if you do some online studies, regardless of the environment you are in. So the first thing that you will be asking yourself is that what you are supposed to do. So you represent the problem you are going to solve. So this is the first step, representation. And then perhaps the experiment will offer you a few options. So you are sitting in front of the computer, and then the computer will show you some stimuli. And you are trying to figure out, okay, there are multiple options, and what am I going to do? So the step before you actually making the action, you are in fact evaluate the value of the options. So if there are 4 options presented in front of you, you have no idea what they are, but you might have a rough estimation regarding which is more valuable, which is not. But maybe at the beginning, all of the 4 options, that is random, right? At the beginning, you randomly choose a option, but still the randomness at the very beginning is still a evaluation, right? Because you have no idea what the environment is. Your evaluation in the first place is randomness. So according to this evaluation, you will then make your choice. So maybe the first one is random is okay. And then after you're making the choice, you will see the outcome. So similar idea as here, you have an uncertain environment you're about to interact with, you draw action, and then you receive the feedback. And the feedback here will be used for you to learn the environment. And after learning, maybe the 4 options or the 4 stimuli, they are not random anymore. And one maybe has a higher value than the others, and then you will choose it accordingly. And then you will receive feedback again and learn again, and you do this back and forth, back and forth until you have a much more precise estimation of the environment, okay? So this is the conceptual idea. And so for many of you, even though maybe, so I mean, for your master thesis or master work, master Arbeit, if you're in any case interested in decision-making or learning, I think this framework is pretty helpful, okay? It can also be done with artwork. So I think I mentioned this one. So in the EVA lab here at the faculty, and then they are I think one of the work is that they present paintings to participants. So one is with more symmetrical layouts, and the other one is perhaps asymmetrical. And then the assumption or the hypothesis that people a priori, they prefer symmetrical paintings. But sometimes, so those are stimuli, right? Stimuli can be related to reward in our case. So there are just 2 choice options. Maybe I show you one more thing and then we talk about this art project. So usually what we do in this kind of decision-making paradigm is that we show people multiple choice options, in this case 2, and then participants, they are about to choose one from them. And after making the choice, as the framework illustrated, they will receive it feedback. So in this case, to get a reward, 20 cents, and then they will do this repeatedly. So they will use this feedback to update their evaluation regarding the blue options. In this case, at the beginning, blue and yellow, they are random, they mean nothing. But after getting a positive reward, so the participants will be more likely to choose the blue because the blue one is more rewarded and then the action is reinforced, okay? So this is the idea. So let's talk about the art project, if I get it correctly. So here, let's say there are 2 choice options. One is a painting with more symmetrical layout. The other one is a painting with an asymmetrical layout. And assumption is that people might prefer the symmetrical layout better than the asymmetrical one, but they don't know that the symmetrical or the asymmetrical stimuli, the reward probability that's associated with. So then here we could talk about a quite interesting experimental design. So let me try to draw something. Yeah. Okay, good. So let's say we have something like symmetrical. This is symmetrical. This is something asymmetrical. Okay. And then we could have something like reward probability. Okay, so this is P of getting money, reward, probability of reward. So here we have something like 80%, here 20, and we have a reverse one, so 20, 80, okay, good. The idea here is that if they prefer a priori symmetrical paintings, they will learn this one much easier because the symmetrical stimulus is associated with higher probability, and it's much easier for participants to learn that this one is much more rewarding. They like it, and they also get positive feedback by choosing it. This is good. And the interesting part might be this here, right? So in another condition, they say, well, they see that, well, okay, good, there is asymmetrical painting, I just choose it regardless. But then I gradually find out that in the long run, it doesn't give me too much reward. I have to overcome my bias towards the symmetrical painting to choose the other one. because even though this one doesn't look so nice relative to the symmetrical painting, this one gives money, right? So this can be a quite interesting experiment, and I'm not sure if they've done that. If they don't, propose it to them, and then this can be your master thesis. Good. Right, this is task. So we're not satisfied about doing a summary statistic to analyze how much the participants are choosing the higher rewarded option in the long run. So if we ask the participants to make a choice for 100 trials, 100 times, if the blue one is the better option in the long run, and we could analyze how often the participants are choosing the blue option. And this is the choice accuracy. And we could see, well, if the choice accuracy is interesting between different conditions, maybe condition in the sense that control condition versus some pharmacological manipulation, some dopamine drugs, because that might change participants' reward sensitivity. And we're not satisfied with that. We are more interested in the latent process that is going on. So why the participants is making the choice on a trial by trial base to understand what can be the underlying mechanisms underlying the task choice, the choice behavior. So here, any time that you are presented with an experiment, so it can be your experiment, it can be experiment from the others, and you are analyzing the data. So the very first thing is to ask yourself, what is known, what is unknown, right? This is what we have been talking about from even the beginning. So here, what is known? So we don't know. We know only quite some simple data variables. So here we know the choice. We know on each trial which choice option the participants is choosing. We know whether the participants is choosing blue or yellow, blue, yellow, and we also know the corresponding outcome of that choice. So if they choose blue, they get a win on the first trial, or maybe then if they choose blue again, and then they get a loss on the second trial. Okay, so we just know the choice and outcome. Good. Perhaps also reaction times. It depends on how you log your experimental files. So what we measure here is the summary statistics I mentioned. We could analyze simply the choice accuracy, how often they choose the more rewarding option. And then I said, so okay, the last thing, and also the more important thing or more interesting thing is what is the learning algorithm? So in this case, the reinforcement learning updates, okay? So here, this is again the task. So we have 3 stages. Here, the choice representation before making the choice. Here, make the choice, and then lastly, the outcome is represented. It's presented to the participants. And we make the differentiation when we were talking about the model is that there are 2 parts of the model. So one is the cognitive model part, and the other one is the observational model part. So here, this distinction is that in the cognitive model part, this is the place where we assume what might be the cognitive process. So in our case, using the value update part, so we are assuming participants using a reward prediction error. You see the next slide. The participants are using a reward prediction error to update their evaluation regarding the choice option. So this is the cognitive part. So we are assuming the participants is calculating the value in this way or in some other ways. So then you can propose another cognitive model. So if you remember the programming exercise, first model is the risk-Wagner, is the one you will see. The second one is assuming that participants will learn reward and punishment a little bit differently. So in a differential way. So they might learn reward more than punishment, or maybe the other way around. You don't know, right? You have to know, you have to see the parameter after the model fitting. Okay, but anyway, they are the cognitive part. So after the cognitive part, after we are assuming the possible process that is underlying the choice behavior, we have to make the connection, because this is the cognitive part. We are assuming the participants is doing that, but how do we know if the participants is really doing this way? And if there's something unknown, the parameter, how can we link this cognitive part to their actual choice? So then here, this comes in the observation model. The observation model kicks in. So when we have the cognitive part, we have the real data collected from the participants, we can make the connection. So we use some linking function so that the cognitive part can be connected to the real model, okay? And then this connection usually depends on some statistical distribution. It can be normal distribution, can be binomial distribution, can be different distributions. And the typical question that you ask is, what distribution we choose? So how can I know which is which, right? The very first question you ask yourself is, so is the data continuous or discrete? So this is you always have to ask yourself when choosing a proper statistical distribution to model your data. So in our case, the participants are choosing blue, yellow. They are just discrete variables. And then you can see what's available options there are, and then to see which one is much more appropriate to your problem at hand. So in our case, we use a binomial or a categorical distribution, and you know that, we know that already. But in some other cases, think about it. So ask first, is your data continuous or discrete? And then go further. Depends on some other factors. Good. So here, this is the last slide of the recap part. So just to give you one more idea about the Ritzler-Wagner model that you are all familiar with already. So the Ritzler-Wagner model is originally proposed in the 1970s. Originally, it was trying to explain Pavlovian condition, not really action involved. So the dog is hearing the bell, and after that they will see the food, and in the later phases they will hear the bell sound but no food, but they will still have some reaction to the bell because the bell is associated with food reward during the conditioning. So this is how it was used in the beginning, but then this can also be implemented in instrumental conditioning. So in our case, the people have to make a choice. So here, the rough idea is this is a error-driven learning. What does that mean is participants, before they see the output or the outcome, they will have expectation. And afterwards, they will see the outcome. So then you could calculate the difference between the actual reward and the expectation. So essentially, it is the difference between what you actually get and what you expected. So this is the difference, and this is called a prediction error. In other words, the error of the prediction, because the prediction is never perfect, there must be a deviation between your expectation and the actual feedback. Okay, so this difference is called a reward prediction error. And in learning, we could also argue that learning is a process to minimize the prediction error, because at the beginning of something, if you are sitting in front of an unknown environment, if you're hiking in the woods, you don't really know where is where if there is not a red marker on the tree. So it seems quite random. You might be disoriented, but you still have to make a prediction to decide where to go. And until you see the next red marker, your expectation is updated. Okay, it's a similar idea. So you are using your the error of the prediction to update what you think, and eventually you will minimize your prediction error in the long run. So after maybe 2 hours in the woods, in the forest, you are perfectly perfect. You are perfectly accurate in where to go in terms of direction, because you will always look for where is the red mark on the tree, and then you always go there. So the prediction error is minimized, and then you know where to go, and eventually you know where's the train station and you can go home. Okay, so this is the real life example, same. And then here, how this reward prediction error or prediction error is implemented or helped to update your action, your valuation. So here the reward prediction error, here this one is multiplied with a free parameter. So here's the learning rate. It determines how much of the reward prediction error information you will use to update your expectation. So here expectation is updated by a learning rate weighted prediction error, right? So if you think, I don't care about prediction error, so then I make errors and I still do whatever I used to do, then here you could imagine this, there's a zero learning rate. You just don't use the prediction error to update your expectation. And then in another scenario, it's like, well, as long as there is an error, I will use all of the prediction error information to update my, my expectation. Okay, so this is proportion. So this parameter is between 0 and 1. 0 means you don't use it at all. 1 means you use all of the prediction error information. Okay, and the meaning of the prediction, the meaning of the learning rate, we discussed quite a bit. So there is not a golden rule to say, is a lower learning rate good or is higher learning rate good? This is quite a difficult question to ask, to answer. It is because the value or the magnitude of the learning rate depends on the environment. So if the environment is quite stable, in the sense that if in the hiking trail, there is always a red marker, then you don't really need a high learning rate to learn it because the environment is quite stable. But in some other places, if there are sometimes a red marker and some other times there is an orange marker and blue marker, you don't know where to go, right? What do they mean in these different colors? And you might have to learn it fast. So in this changing environments, a relatively higher learning rate might be better to for yourself to learn. Okay, good. So this is the model. So what we've done afterwards is that we implemented the Ritzler-Wagner model in the STAN language. So if you recall the idea of the STAN language, so here. So STAN is the language of implementing Markov chain Monte Carlo, MCMC, for us to estimate the posterior of the parameters given the data we have, okay? And then this is always the reason that I ask you what is known and what is unknown, because STAN, the language, is block-based, and it explicitly asks you as a researcher to define what is known, what is unknown. So if you know what is known, what is unknown, good, you just put what you have in mind into the structure of the STAN language. So here, just a quick recap. The STAN language, it is a block-based language. There are multiple blocks. So here in the first place, it is called data. It is simply the place where we define what we know already. And in the Ritzler-Wagner choice task, what we give here is choice, A, B, blue, yellow, and outcome, win, loss, something like that. And also with some helping variables. For example, how many participants there are, how many trials there are. And then, okay, good, well, this is not necessary. And then here, the transform the data is optional, and what is needed, the next one is parameters. So here we define what we don't know yet, but we are interested in. So here in this case, we have a learning rate. The learning rate is unknown, but we want to know the posterior of the learning rate given the data that we collected. So here in the parameters block, we define or determine or clarify, declare how we call the learning rate. We can call it alpha, we can call it learning rate, which is basically name it. We give a name, and we also have to give the proper range if there is any. So here in this case, the learning rate is a parameter between 0 and 1. So here we can say alpha lower equals 0, upper equals 1. Okay, so in this case, we define or we declare the proper learning rate. Transform the parameters is also optional. And the next important block is the model block. And this is actually the central part of the STAN language. So because data is data, we just define what we know already, the data we collected. And the parameters is to define how we want to name the parameters, and nothing really interesting, right? The interesting part is here, the model block. And here is like the place we define both the cognitive model and also the linking observation model. Here we define how the values is updated according to reward prediction error in the case of Risk-Wagner, and also how this value is translated to action probability. And this action probability is forming the link between the cognitive part and the actual choice. Okay, the data, why they choose blue or why they choose yellow. And after this model block, which is essentially the likelihood, right? And we can also use another quantity to do something interesting. Okay, so those are the blocks. And then I guess with this roughly half an hour recap, then we are about to go to see what we can debug if the STEM program goes wrong. And before that, any questions, comments? Okay, good.